Hello. So we continue with Unit 10, where we are looking at perfect competition in this session, and specifically we're going to look at the profits or loss analysis under perfect competition. I am your host, Elias. Okay, so let me quickly take you through the short run profit or loss analysis. So recall that on the vertical axis, we measure the cost or revenue for the firm, and on the horizontal axis, we put the output. Now, with the perfectly elastic demand curve and an upward sloping marginal cost curve, the firm is in equilibrium at the point where the marginal revenue curve intersects with the marginal cost curve. And that is, at this point, we have our output level labeled Q star, and this is the profit maximizing output for the perfectly competitive firm. And we have the price P, which is taken as given in this industry. Now, we want to look at how to measure the profit or loss for any given any given firm in the perfectly competitive industry. With the average variable cost curve, we can be able to tell at what point the firm will produce or not. But before we get to that, we need to understand that the firm's cost, in this case, let's say average total cost, if you recall from the cost session, average total cost is equal to average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. So given that we have our average variable cost here, it means that if we add the average fixed cost, we will have the average total cost curve as drawn there. Now, you will notice then that the profit for the firm, given as the difference between the total revenue and the total cost, which is total revenue minus total cost, if we wanted to get the profit per unit of output produced, it means we will have to divide through by output. So this is profit per unit, and this one will give us average revenue, and this one will give us average cost. Which means that for each unit produced, if we want to get profit for each unit, we get a difference between the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. So which means that in this case, we will be looking at the difference between the marginal revenue at the profit maximizing price as well as the marginal cost, which means that up to here, we will be getting the firm's profit per unit. And if we get the whole area, it means we will be getting the profit for the whole output produced. And it should be noted that whenever the average total cost curve, whenever the line drawn from the output axis cuts this average total cost curve before the marginal revenue, it means that the firm is making profit. In other words, when the average total cost lies below the marginal revenue curve or the demand curve, the firm will be making profit. So with this then we can draw the output level at that average cost, the price level. So associated with this is the average total cost. So at this point, the difference between the average revenue and the average total cost is the profit per unit. And if we get the whole of this area, we will get the total profit for the firm colored in blue as abnormal profit. So in the short run, firms are able to make abnormal profits, and they are also able to make losses. Now that we have looked at the case of the profit, we can also look at the case of economic losses. But before we go to that, it should be noted that the difference between the average total cost and the average variable cost measures the average fixed cost. So at each output level, that difference will be equal to the average fixed cost for a given firm. Let's look at the economic losses for the perfectly competitive firm with cost or revenue on the vertical axis and the output level on the horizontal axis, and our perfectly elastic demand curve. We see that at this elastic demand curve, if we draw our upward sloping marginal cost curve, we will have output Q star, which is the profit maximizing output. And with our average variable cost curve drawn, where it's meeting the marginal cost at its minimum, and the average total cost, which now happens to be above the average revenue line, it means that now we can find the level of losses that the firm is making. Now, because the average total cost curve is above the average revenue, we see then that the difference here is giving us the losses that the firm is making, and we call this the economic loss. The big question is, should this firm shut down in this case of a loss? Well, economically speaking, and using the concept of rationality, this firm should not shut down despite the losses that are being made. This is because at this price level, we see that the firm is covering all the variable costs. So we see that up to here, this is the average variable cost is the variable cost per unit of output. So the firm is able to cover all the variable costs measured up to this point. So all these are variable costs. And then the difference between the average variable cost and the average total cost is the average fixed cost, meaning that the whole of this area here measures the total fixed cost. So the firm is able to cover all the variable costs and part of the fixed costs. And if the firm was to shut down, it means that then it will have to pay all this amount of the fixed cost which is incurred in the production process. Whereas what we are seeing here is that production is able to allow the firm cover part of the fixed cost up to this much, and then the remaining gap is what it is paying. Therefore, it is efficient for this firm to continue producing. But maybe talking about the firm closing down, let's look at this analysis where we're going to determine the shutdown point. The question is, what is the shutdown point for a firm operating under perfect competition? Well, we have just seen that a firm will have to look at the variable costs as well as the fixed costs. And if it is able to cover all the variable costs and cover some fixed costs, it means the firm will do well by continuing in its production. Let's look at the graphical illustration. With cost and revenue on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis with our perfectly elastic demand curve and an upward sloping marginal cost curve, let's start by drawing our average variable cost curve. So with the average variable cost curve that is tangent to the marginal revenue as well as the marginal cost, we see that at this minimum point, the firm is able to cover all the variable costs. But is this firm making profits or losses? Well, for us to know, we need the average total cost curve. So with the average total cost curve above, and if we extend this line, we're able to see that this firm will be making losses. And these losses which the firm is making are equal to the fixed costs. So it is able to cover all the variable costs, but it's covering zero of the fixed costs. and these losses are still called economic losses. At this point then, when the price is equal to the minimum, when the price is equal to the minimum, let's call it mean average variable cost, at this level, the firm should be deciding whether to continue producing or not. This is because whether the firm continues to produce or shut down, the impact will be the same from the firm's side, because the fixed costs will still be incurred with or without production. Therefore, if the firm continues to produce, it will do so for the purpose of maybe allowing the business to continue existing or to keep the existing customers with it. But it should be noted, therefore, that if the price goes below P, then this firm will definitely cease production, because it will now be paying the fixed cost from its pocket as well as part of the variable costs. As such, the shutdown point is a price, any price set below the minimum average variable cost. Okay, so now that we know the shutdown point, we can now analyze this clearly by seeing what will happen to this firm, maybe in terms of an illustration with numbers. But let's look at the supply function for the firm. So already we know that in equilibrium we are producing Q star at the price P, and in this case we are seeing that the firm is making losses. But then the big question is, what is the supply curve for the firm? Well, it should be noted that since the shutdown point is a price set at the minimum of the average variable cost, and that the firm will not produce anything below that price, and for any price above, the firm will be more than happy to produce, it means that then all the way from the minimum average variable cost, the whole part of the supply curve that is above the minimum average variable cost measures or gives the supply curve for the firm, and we can denote that with the black line. So all the way from the minimum average variable cost going up, that is the supply curve for the firm. Below that, the firm will not produce. Let's continue with short run profit or loss. So the firm should not produce, but should shut down in the short run if its losses exceed its fixed cost. Now, if it can only exceed its fixed cost if it is also covering the variable costs, and as such, the firm should shut down. By shutting down, its losses will just equal those fixed costs, because now that it has ceased production, any part of the losses that was as a result of the variable costs will be zero, and only the fixed cost will be incurred. And remember, when we first introduced fixed costs, we made mention that these are costs that the firm will incur whether it produces or not. Therefore, if all the losses are equal to the fixed, if the losses are more than the fixed costs, then shutting down will allow the losses to be equal to the fixed costs, and this will make the losses to be minimized. And as such, we see that fixed costs in real life may include rentals that the firm would pay for the buildings, the business licenses, the equipment lease, and so on. Okay, so now suppose that firm's fixed cost is $100 and its minimum average variable cost is $55. If the market price is $50, you will see that this $50 is less than the minimum average variable cost, and as such the firm will be losing $5 more by producing each unit. This is because the price has been set below the minimum average variable cost, and that means that 5 is as a result of the variable cost. And if the firm continues to produce, it will be incurring this $5 in excess to what it already has to pay for the fixed costs. And if the firm produces 1 unit, its total losses will be 5 plus the $100 fixed cost, which brings the total loss to 105. And if the firm shuts down, it means the only fixed cost it will incur will be the $100, meaning it will be able to save the $5. If the firm decides to shut down, remember, its losses will only be $100. Okay. Now, shutdown would then minimize the losses for the firm, and therefore it is called the loss minimizing strategy for a given firm. Now, what if the price is set at $60? Should the firm shut down? The answer is no. If the price is set above the minimum average variable cost, say at 60, it means now that the firm will be covering part of the fixed costs, because the variable cost goes up to 55. Then the other 5 covers part of the fixed costs for the firm, meaning the only costs the firm will be paying is $95 as opposed to $100 if it was to shut down. As such, if the firm produces 1 unit, its total cost would be fixed costs less the $5, which is being covered by the operational price of 60. And then the losses will be 95. The firm is then better off to produce than shutting down, because it is able to get a $5 from the operation and then pay to as part of its fixed costs. In a schedule illustration, we can see that the first column is showing us the quantities produced by the firm, and then the total revenue associated by this production, and then the total cost. And remember that given that we have the profits, the firm's profit maximizing rule is that it has to produce output where the total profit is maximum. And we see that total profit is maximum at the 5th unit, because this is where any addition will not be entertained. Clearly seen from the marginal revenue marginal cost rule, we see that given the marginal revenue of 6, we see that the marginal cost will be increasing all the way, and then only at the 5th unit are we seeing marginal revenue equal to marginal cost for this firm. And marginal revenue is 6 and marginal cost will be 6 when output produced is 5. There are cases where you cannot determine them using the marginal revenue marginal cost rule, because probably they are never equal, and maybe what is causing that gap is maybe a minimal difference due to the firm's operation. Let's look at this illustration. Consider this table where output produced ranges from 0 all the way to 10, and from this you will see that if you follow the marginal revenue marginal cost rule, you will not be able to get the point at which the two are equal. However, the general rule which will apply here is that you need to pick a point where marginal revenue, the least of all the highest before hitting the marginal revenue, the highest marginal cost value should tally with the marginal revenue, and then that becomes your profit maximizing level. And if it doesn't, it means that the highest before, let me just say the one that is immediate to the marginal revenue before exceeding the marginal revenue, that becomes your profit maximizing marginal cost level. In this case, we are looking at 130, because after 130, marginal cost will be above the marginal revenue, and then it will have already exceeded. So in this case, the profit maximizing level of output is the output level where marginal cost is 130 and marginal revenue is 131. And at this level, the firm will produce 9 units and make a profit of 299. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, please send an email to moaelias@gmail.com. I will see you in session 3 where we're going to look at the long run.